Rebecca Wilson clutched her leather briefcase tightly as she walked up the courthouse steps. Her heart pounded, but her face showed nothing. At 32 years old, she had never lost a case, though few people knew this fact. She wore simple black glasses, a plain navy suit, and kept her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Nothing about her suggested anything special. Inside, the hallway buzzed with reporters and lawyers. This case had drawn attention across the city, a small community center fighting against unfair zoning laws that seemed designed to shut down places where minorities gathered. Rebecca believed in this case deeply, more than anyone knew. "There she is," whispered a young intern to his colleague. "That's Rebecca Wilson, the attorney taking on City Hall." "Doesn't look like much," the other replied with a shrug. Rebecca heard them but kept walking. She was used to being underestimated. In fact, she counted on it. What no one in this building knew was that Rebecca Wilson was not her real name, not entirely. She was actually Ariana Santos, known to millions as music superstar Ariana Grande. She had put her legal career on hold years ago when her singing took off, but had never stopped following the law. She kept her license active and occasionally took special cases under her birth name, Rebecca Wilson, when something truly mattered to her. This community center had given her a safe place to study when she was a struggling student from a poor neighborhood. Now it faced closure from people who didn't understand its importance. She couldn't stand by and watch. The courtroom doors opened, and Rebecca took her seat at the front table. Her client, Mr. Jackson, the elderly director of the community center, sat beside her looking worried. "Don't worry," she told him quietly. "We'd have the law on our side." "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Blackwood," called the bailiff. The judge entered, his face stern and cold. At 65, Judge Blackwood had a reputation for being tough, especially on young lawyers. Even more so with women. Rebecca had researched him thoroughly and knew exactly what to expect. As everyone sat down, Judge Blackwood looked over his glasses at Rebecca. "I see we have new faces today," he said, his voice carrying a hint of boredom. "Ms. Wilson, is it? You're representing the community center." "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca replied, her voice clear and confident. "Well," he said with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, "let's hope you're prepared. I don't appreciate having my time wasted by inexperienced counsel." A few lawyers in the back chuckled softly. They had seen this before. Blackwood putting young lawyers in their place before the case even started. Rebecca simply nodded. "I'm fully prepared, Your Honor." The opposing counsel, a tall man with gray hair from a big law firm, smiled at her with false kindness. "Perhaps Ms. Wilson would like more time to review our latest filings. We'd be happy to suggest a postponement." "That won't be necessary," Rebecca answered, not even looking at him. "I've reviewed everything thoroughly." Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Very well. Let's begin with opening statements. Ms. Wilson, since you're so prepared, why don't you start?" Rebecca stood up smoothly, leaving her notes on the table. She didn't need them. She had prepared for weeks, memorizing every detail, every law, every precedent that might help her case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice changing subtly into something powerful that filled the room, "this case is about more than zoning laws. It's about equal protection under the law." For the next 5 minutes, she laid out her case with perfect clarity. No wasted words, no emotional appeals, just facts and law, precisely delivered. Judge Blackwood's expression changed from dismissive to surprised, then carefully neutral. He hadn't expected this level of preparation. When she finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped to listen. "Well," Judge Blackwood said finally, "it seems you come prepared after all, Ms. Wilson. Let's see if you can maintain this level of professionalism throughout the proceedings." Rebecca sat down, knowing the battle had just begun. She caught Mr. Jackson looking at her with new hope in his eyes. "That was amazing," he whispered. Rebecca gave him a small smile. That was just the beginning. The second day of the trial started with dark clouds outside the courthouse windows. Judge Blackwood seemed to bring that same stormy energy into the courtroom. He tapped his fingers on the desk, watching Rebecca with narrowed eyes as she organized her papers. "Ms. Wilson, I hope you're ready to move things along today," he said, his voice carrying a clear warning. "I have other cases waiting." "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca replied calmly. I'm prepared to call our first witness. The witness was an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who had used the community center for 15 years. As Rebecca guided her through carefully planned questions, the woman's story began to touch everyone in the room. She explained how the center had taught her English, helped her find a job, and given her grandchildren a safe place to study after school. Just as Mrs. Chen was describing how the new zoning laws would force her to travel across town for similar services, Judge Blackwood interrupted. Ms. Wilson, where exactly are you going with this emotional testimony? This is a legal proceeding, not a charity fundraiser. A few lawyers in the back chuckled. Rebecca noticed the opposing counsel smirking. Your Honor, Rebecca responded, standing straight. Mrs. Chen's testimony directly relates to the community impact section of our brief, pages 23 through 27, which demonstrates the disproportionate burden these laws place on protected classes under the Equal Protection Clause. Judge Blackwood blinked, clearly not expecting such a precise legal reference. He flipped through the documents in front of him. Proceed, he said finally, but keep it relevant. Rebecca continued questioning Mrs. Chen, building a strong foundation for her case. When the opposing lawyer, Mr. Peterson, stood for cross-examination, his questions were harsh, trying to make the woman seem confused or unreliable. Objection, Rebecca called. Counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled. Judge Blackwood said quickly. Ms. Wilson, perhaps you should let Mr. Peterson conduct his cross-examination without interruption. He has been practicing law since before you were born. Actually, Your Honor, Rebecca replied without missing a beat. The federal rules of evidence apply equally regardless of an attorney's age or experience. And Rule 611 clearly states that the court should protect witnesses from harassment. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Blackwood's face turned slightly red. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice dangerously low, approached the bench. Rebecca walked forward calmly. Mr. Peterson joined her in front of the judge. Listen carefully, Judge Blackwood whispered angrily. I don't know which law school taught you to lecture judges on rules they've been applying for 30 years, but in my courtroom, you will show proper respect. I apologize if I seem disrespectful, Your Honor, Rebecca replied quietly. I'm simply advocating for my client as the law requires me to do. Your theatrical delivery sounds like you're performing rather than practicing law, the judge said mockingly. Like some pop star reading lines someone else wrote. Save the drama for someone who's impressed by it. Mr. Peterson chuckled beside her. Perhaps Ms. Wilson missed her calling on the stage, Your Honor. Neither man realized how close to the truth they had stumbled. Rebecca simply nodded politely. I'll keep that in mind, Your Honor. As they returned to their tables, Rebecca noticed a young woman in the back row staring at her with unusual intensity. Something about the look made Rebecca uncomfortable, like she was trying to place where she'd seen her before. The day continued with more witnesses. With each one, Rebecca demonstrated deep knowledge of both the law and the facts of the case. Though Judge Blackwood continued making dismissive comments, she noticed him watching her more carefully as the hours passed. During the afternoon break, Rebecca overheard two court clerks talking in the hallway. Blackwood is being especially hard on that Wilson woman, one said. Yeah, but she's handling it better than most. Did you see how she quoted that zoning statute from memory, complete with subsection numbers? I know. I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that. Who is she anyway? Rebecca smiled to herself as she walked past them toward the restroom. Inside, she checked her tight bun in the mirror, making sure no strand of her familiar hair had escaped. She adjusted her glasses and took a deep breath. Just one day at a time, she whispered to herself, they're starting to listen. When she returned to the courtroom, Judge Blackwood was already seated, looking thoughtful as he reviewed his notes. The battle was far from over, but Rebecca knew she was beginning to crack his tough exterior. Tomorrow would be even more challenging. The opposition's expert witnesses would take the stand. She was ready for them. By the third day of the trial, word had spread through the courthouse about the young female attorney who stood her ground against Judge Blackwood. The courtroom was now packed with spectators, including several law students who had come to watch Rebecca in action. Today was crucial. The opposition would present their expert witness, Dr. Howard Miller, a city planning specialist known for helping municipalities create zoning laws that pushed out undesirable establishments. Rebecca had studied his previous testimony in other cases and knew exactly what to expect. Dr. Miller took the stand looking confident in an expensive suit. Mr. Peterson smiled as he began questioning his star witness. Dr. Miller, in your expert opinion, are the zoning changes reasonable for an urban development area like this one? Absolutely, Dr. Miller replied, adjusting his glasses. These changes follow standard urban renewal procedures. The community center simply doesn't fit the new vision for the neighborhood. For 30 minutes, Dr. Miller presented charts and maps showing how the neighborhood would improve with the center gone. Rebecca took careful notes, her face revealing nothing. Judge Blackwood watched her with curiosity, perhaps wondering if yesterday's performance had been a fluke. Your witness, Ms. Wilson, Mr. Peterson said, returning to his seat with a satisfied smile. Rebecca approached the witness stand slowly. Good morning, Dr. Miller. You've testified in similar cases before, correct? Yes, 17 times, he answered proudly. And in how many of those cases were you paid by the same 3 development companies that are supporting these zoning changes? Dr. Miller's smile faltered. I'm not sure of the exact number. Would 15 sound accurate? I have the court records here, Rebecca said, holding up a folder. Objection. Mr. Peterson jumped to his feet. Counsel is trying to imply bias without foundation. Your Honor, Rebecca responded calmly, the witness's financial relationships are directly relevant to evaluating his testimony. Judge Blackwood studied her for a moment. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Ms. Wilson. For the next 45 minutes, Rebecca methodically dismantled Dr. Miller's credibility. She quoted his own contradictory statements from previous cases. She revealed that the standard procedures he mentioned had been rejected by 3 major cities for disproportionately affecting minority communities. Dr. Miller began to sweat. These are complex urban planning issues. I don't expect a young attorney to fully grasp. Dr. Miller, Rebecca interrupted, is it your position that the Richardson v. City of Portland case was wrongly decided when it found that these exact same standard procedures violated equal protection laws? The expert's face went pale. I wasn't aware you were familiar with that case. I'm familiar with all 37 cases that have addressed this issue in federal courts over the past decade, Rebecca replied, including the 7 where your testimony was specifically rejected by the judge. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Blackwood, instead of shutting down the questioning as everyone expected, leaned forward with interest. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson stood again, looking worried. Counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Is she? I see an attorney thoroughly cross-examining an expert witness. Continue, Ms. Wilson. Rebecca nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Turning back to Dr. Miller, she continued, let's discuss the actual impact studies that were conducted. By the time Rebecca finished her cross-examination, Dr. Miller looked defeated. The opposition's star witness had been thoroughly discredited. As he stepped down from the stand, Rebecca noticed Judge Blackwood watching her with a new expression, something between suspicion and reluctant respect. During the lunch break, Rebecca sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, reviewing her notes for the afternoon session. She heard footsteps approach and looked up to see Judge Blackwood standing there. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice less harsh than before. That was impressive work this morning. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied, surprised by the compliment. Where did you practice before this case? I don't recall seeing you in my courtroom before. Rebecca had prepared for this question. I've worked mostly on paper filings and settlements for the past few years. This is my return to trial work. He studied her face carefully. You remind me of someone, but I can't place who. Rebecca's heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. I have one of those faces, I suppose. Perhaps, he said, not sounding convinced. Well, I look forward to the rest of your presentation. It's rare to see such thorough preparation. The 4th day of the trial brought unexpected tension to the courtroom. News of Rebecca's brilliant performance had spread, and every seat was filled. Law students crowded the back row, reporters waited outside, and the young woman who had been watching Rebecca sat in the 2nd row, still staring intently. Rebecca noticed her as she set up her materials. Something about the woman's gaze made her nervous, but she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the day ahead. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Blackwood, the bailiff announced. The judge entered, his usual stern expression replaced by something more thoughtful. He nodded toward Rebecca before taking his seat. Ms. Wilson, you may call your next witness, he said. Thank you, Your Honor. The community center calls Maria Vasquez. A young woman of about 20 walked to the witness stand. She wore a simple dress and looked nervous as she was sworn in. Ms. Vasquez, can you tell the court about your experience with the community center? Rebecca asked gently. It saved my life, Maria said simply. 5 years ago, I was homeless. The center gave me a place to study, take computer classes, and eventually apply for college. Now I'm studying to be a nurse. Rebecca guided Maria through her testimony, showing how the center provided crucial services that weren't available anywhere else in the area. As Maria spoke, several jurors nodded in sympathy. Then came the cross-examination. Mr. Peterson approached the witness with a folder. Ms. Vasquez, isn't it true that you were arrested 3 years ago? Objection. Rebecca was on her feet instantly. This question is irrelevant and intended only to embarrass the witness. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson argued. This goes to the witness's character and truthfulness. Judge Blackwood frowned. Approach the bench, both of you. As the attorney stood before him, the judge spoke in a low voice. Mr. Peterson, where are you going with this? Her juvenile record shows a shoplifting charge that was later dismissed. It speaks to her character. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger. A dismissed juvenile charge is both inadmissible and sealed by law. Counsel knows this and is deliberately trying to taint the jury's perception. Judge Blackwood looked at Mr. Peterson with disappointment. The objection is sustained. Mr. Peterson, I expect better from an attorney of your experience. The jury will disregard the question entirely. As they returned to their tables, Rebecca noticed Mr. Peterson's face was red with embarrassment. She had won that round decisively. After Maria stepped down, Rebecca called her final witness, the community center's financial director, who provided clear evidence that the center could comply with reasonable regulations without needing to close. No further questions, Your Honor, Rebecca said as she finished. Very well, Judge Blackwood replied. We'll take a 15-minute recess before closing arguments. During the break, Rebecca stepped into the hallway for a moment of quiet. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing for her closing argument. Suddenly, she felt someone standing close behind her. I know who you are, a voice whispered. Rebecca turned quickly to see the young woman who had been watching her all week. Excuse me, Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. You're Ariana Grande, the woman said quietly. I'm your biggest fan. I've been to every one of your concerts in this state. Rebecca's heart pounded. I think you're confusing me with someone else. No, I'm not, the woman insisted. Your voice, your eyes. You can change your hair and wear glasses, but I'd recognize you anywhere. Why are you pretending to be a lawyer? I need to get back to the courtroom, Rebecca said, trying to move past her. Wait. The woman grabbed her arm. I won't tell anyone, I promise. I just want to know why. Before Rebecca could answer, she heard the bailiff calling everyone back to the courtroom. I really need to go, she said firmly, pulling away. Walking back into the courtroom, Rebecca felt shaken. Her carefully constructed identity was beginning to crack. She took her seat at the table, trying to focus on her notes, but her mind was racing. What if the young woman told others? What if someone believed her? Just as the judge entered, Rebecca felt a tap on her shoulder. Mr. Jackson, her client, leaned forward. Are you okay? He whispered. You look pale. I'm fine, she assured him, straightening her papers. Judge Blackwood looked around the courtroom. We will now hear closing arguments. Mr. Peterson, you may begin. As the opposing counsel delivered his closing argument, Rebecca tried to gather her thoughts. Everything depended on the next few minutes. She had to put aside her fears and focus on winning this case. When Mr. Peterson finished, Judge Blackwood turned to her. Ms. Wilson, her closing argument. The courtroom remained completely silent as every eye fixed on Rebecca. She stood perfectly still for a moment, her mind racing. Everything she had worked so hard to build was at risk of falling apart. She glanced at Mr. Jackson, whose face showed confusion and concern. Ms. Wilson, Judge Blackwood prompted again, his voice stern but curious. "The court is waiting for your response." Rebecca took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to request a brief recess to address this unusual situation in your chambers, if possible." Judge Blackwood studied her face carefully, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to actually see her for the first time. After a long moment, he nodded. "Very well. This court will take a 30-minute recess. Ms. Wilson, Mr. Peterson, my chambers immediately." He banged his gavel. "Bailiff, please make sure the person who caused this disruption remains in the courthouse. I may want to speak with her as well." As the crowd began buzzing with excitement, Rebecca gathered her papers with shaking hands. Mr. Jackson leaned forward. "What's happening?" he whispered. "Is what that woman said true?" "Trust me," Rebecca replied quietly. "This doesn't change anything about our case. The law is still on our side." Walking to the judge's chambers felt like the longest journey of her life. Rebecca could feel everyone watching her, whispering as she passed. Mr. Peterson walked beside her, looking both confused and oddly pleased by this unexpected development. Inside the judge's private office, Judge Blackwood closed the door firmly and took a seat behind his desk. He didn't invite either attorney to sit. "Now," he said, looking directly at Rebecca, "explain yourself." Rebecca straightened her shoulders and carefully removed her glasses. Then she reached up and pulled the pins from her tight bun, allowing her distinctive hair to fall around her shoulders. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. "My legal name is Ariana Santos," she said calmly. "Rebecca Wilson is my middle and mother's maiden names, which I use for legal work. I am indeed the performer known as Ariana Grande, but more importantly, I am a licensed attorney in good standing with the bar." Mr. Peterson's mouth fell open in shock. "This is outrageous. This is some kind of publicity stunt." Judge Blackwood held up his hand to silence him. "I'm more interested in whether any laws or court rules have been broken." He turned back to Rebecca. "Continue, Ms. Santos." "I graduated from Harvard Law School 10 years ago, Your Honor. I passed the bar exam before my music career took off. I've maintained my license and continued my legal education requirements every year." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out several documents, placing them on his desk. "Here are my credentials, including my bar card and law school diploma." Judge Blackwood examined the papers carefully. "Why the disguise? Why not simply appear as yourself?" "Because this case deserves to be decided on its legal merits, not on celebrity," Rebecca explained. "The community center helped me when I was a struggling student from a poor neighborhood. I wanted to help them without turning their legal fight into a media circus about me." "Well, that plan has clearly failed," Mr. Peterson interjected angrily. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate mistrial. This deception has tainted the entire proceedings." Judge Blackwood's eyes never left Rebecca's face. "Have you misrepresented any facts of the case, Ms. Santos? Have you presented any false evidence or made any incorrect legal arguments?" "No, Your Honor. Everything I presented is factual and legally sound." "Have you ever appeared in court under this alternate identity before?" "Yes, Your Honor. 3 times for pro bono cases." She placed another document on his desk. "This is a letter from Judge Martinez in the Southern District, confirming my appearance before our court last year." Judge Blackwood read the letter, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked up at her with new interest. "So you've been living a double life, international pop star and occasional attorney. Most people would find that unusual." "I find it fulfilling," Rebecca replied simply. "The law was my first love before music took me in another direction. I never wanted to abandon it completely." Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, thinking. Finally, he turned to Mr. Peterson. "I see no grounds for a mistrial. An attorney using her legal name, regardless of her other professional identities, breaks no court rules." "But the jury," Mr. Peterson protested. "Once they know who she really is." "That's a valid concern," Judge Blackwood admitted. He thought for a moment longer. "Here's what we'll do. We'll return to court. Ms. Santos will complete her closing argument as planned." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Blackwood returned to his seat. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Everyone had heard the shouting, and rumors were already spreading through whispers. Rebecca walked in behind the judge, her appearance now noticeably different. Though she still wore her professional suit, her hair was down in its natural style, and she had removed her fake glasses. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel for order. "Before we continue," he announced firmly, "I need to address the disruption that occurred. The identity of counsel for the community center is not relevant to these proceedings. This court will focus only on the legal arguments and evidence presented. Any spectator who cannot maintain proper decorum will be removed immediately." He looked directly at the young woman who had caused the outburst. She sank lower in her seat, looking embarrassed but excited. "Ms. Wilson will now present her closing argument," Judge Blackwood continued, deliberately using her legal name. "The jury is instructed to consider only the legal merits of the case." Rebecca walked to the center of the courtroom. She could feel every eye on her, studying her face with new interest. Mr. Jackson looked confused, staring at her as if seeing a stranger. The jury members whispered among themselves until Judge Blackwood silenced them with a stern look. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca began her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice clear and confident, "this case is about one simple question. Does the law protect all citizens equally, or can it be used to push certain groups out of a neighborhood?" As she spoke, something remarkable happened. The initial shock of her identity faded, replaced by the power of her legal argument. Her voice, trained through years of performing, filled the courtroom perfectly. Every word carried weight and conviction. "The evidence clearly shows that these zoning changes were designed specifically to close the community center. The city's own documents, which I presented as Exhibit C, show that officials discussed ways to clean up the neighborhood by removing gathering places for undesirable elements." She moved closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "But the people who use this center are not undesirable elements. They are citizens with equal rights under the law. They are students trying to improve their lives. They are elderly people seeking community. They are families needing safe spaces for their children." Rebecca turned and gestured toward Mr. Jackson. "Mr. Jackson has run this center for 25 years. In that time, over 5,000 people have learned to read there. 300 have earned their high school equivalency diplomas. Countless children have found safety after school while their parents worked. The law is clear on this matter. In Richardson v. City of Portland, the court ruled that zoning laws cannot be used to target community services used primarily by protected groups. In Jameson v. Westfield County, the court found that disparate impact alone is enough to invalidate such regulations. Rebecca noticed Judge Blackwood nodding slightly as she cited these cases. His earlier mockery had been replaced by genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, the community center is willing to make reasonable accommodations. They have offered to improve the building's appearance, reduce operating hours in the evening, and address parking concerns. What they cannot do, what the law does not allow them to be forced to do, is cease existing because their presence doesn't fit someone's idea of a better neighborhood." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The Constitution promises equal protection under the law to all citizens. Today, you have the power to ensure that promise is kept. I ask you to find in favor of the community center and strike down these discriminatory zoning changes. Thank you." As Rebecca returned to her seat, the courtroom remained completely silent. Even Mr. Peterson seemed impressed by her argument. Judge Blackwood looked at her for a long moment before turning to the opposing counsel. "Mr. Peterson, your closing argument." The opposing lawyer seemed flustered as he approached the jury. His well-prepared closing suddenly felt inadequate after Rebecca's powerful presentation. As he spoke, several jurors continued to glance at Rebecca, their expressions thoughtful. When both closings were finished, Judge Blackwood addressed the jury. "You have heard the evidence and arguments. You will now deliberate and reach a verdict based solely on the facts and the law. Nothing else should influence your decision." As the jury filed out, Rebecca felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mr. Jackson. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked quietly. He smiled slowly. "I suppose not. The law is still the law, no matter who argues it." Everyone expected the jury to deliberate for hours, maybe even days. But just 90 minutes after they left the courtroom, the bailiff announced their return. The quick decision made Rebecca nervous. In her experience, fast verdicts often went against the plaintiff. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread. Reporters who had been waiting outside rushed in, taking every available space. Judge Blackwood entered and took his seat, his face showing no emotion. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked formally. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read your verdict." The forewoman opened a small piece of paper. "In the case of Jackson Community Center versus the City of Westfield, we find in favor of the plaintiff, the Jackson Community Center." The room erupted in cheers. Mr. Jackson grabbed Rebecca's hand, tears forming in his eyes. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel several times. "Order. There will be order in my court." As the noise settled, the judge continued. "The jury's verdict is recorded. This court finds that the zoning changes targeted at the Jackson Community Center violate equal protection principles and are therefore invalid." He turned to Rebecca. "Ms. Wilson, your argument regarding disparate impact was particularly persuasive. The court will issue a permanent injunction preventing the city from enforcing these specific zoning changes against your client." "Thank you, Your Honor," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Judge Blackwood addressed the entire courtroom. "This court is adjourned." He banged his gavel one final time. As people began to leave, reporters rushed toward Rebecca, shouting questions. The bailiff quickly moved between them. "No media in the courtroom. Take it outside." Rebecca gathered her papers, trying to process what had just happened. They had won. The community center was safe. Her identity was revealed, but it hadn't affected the outcome. Judge Blackwood approached her table while everyone was distracted. "Ms. Santos," he said quietly, using her real name for the first time, "would you join me in my chambers briefly?" Rebecca nodded and followed him, wondering what he wanted. Inside his office, Judge Blackwood closed the door and sat behind his desk. This time, he gestured for her to sit. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "Your Honor, my behavior toward you during this trial was unprofessional. I made assumptions based on your appearance and apparent age. I mocked your presentation style. I was dismissive of your legal arguments until you forced me to recognize their merit." He leaned forward. "In 30 years on the bench, I'd never seen a more thoroughly prepared attorney or a more compelling closing argument." "Thank you, Your Honor," Rebecca said, genuinely moved by his words. "May I ask you something personal?" When she nodded, he continued. "Why continue practicing law when your music career is so successful? Surely you don't need to work these cases." Rebecca smiled slightly. "It's not about need, Your Honor. The law has always been my passion. Music became my career somewhat unexpectedly, but I never wanted to abandon my legal training completely." "And the community center? Why this case specifically?" "When I was 16, my family struggled financially. The center gave me a quiet place to study when our apartment was too crowded and noisy. Mr. Jackson helped me apply to college and find scholarships. Without the center, I might never have made it to law school." Judge Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Well, they were fortunate to have you return to help them." "Will my identity cause problems for the verdict if the city appeals?" Rebecca asked, voicing her main concern. "No," the judge assured her. "Your legal standing is solid, and your arguments were based entirely on law and fact. Your other career is irrelevant to the case." He stood and extended his hand. "Counselor, it's been an education having you in my courtroom." Rebecca shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she turned to leave, Judge Blackwood added, "Ms. Santos, I hope this won't be your last case." Rebecca paused at the door. "It won't be. There are too many people who need someone to fight for them." Outside, reporters surrounded her immediately, cameras flashing. The story was already spreading across social media. Famous pop star, secretly brilliant attorney wins major civil rights case. But as Rebecca faced the cameras, she thought only of Mr. Jackson and the community center that would now remain open, continuing to change lives as it had once changed hers. 3 months after the trial, the Jackson Community Center held a special celebration. Colorful banners hung across the entrance, and a small stage had been set up in the main hall. The room was packed with neighborhood residents, students, and families, all the people who depended on the center. Rebecca stood at the back, watching the happy crowd. She wore casual clothes, jeans, and a simple blouse, with her hair down in its natural style. No more disguises. Since the trial, she had embraced both sides of her life openly. "There she is," called Mr. Jackson from the stage. "The woman who saved our center. Please welcome Rebecca Santos." The crowd erupted in applause as Rebecca walked toward the stage. Children waved at her excitedly. Older people who used the center's services smiled with gratitude. "Thank you, everyone," Rebecca said when the clapping finally died down. "But I didn't save the center alone. The law was on our side. Justice was on our side." She looked around at the familiar walls that had given her shelter as a teenager. "This place changes lives. It changed mine years ago, and it continues to change lives today." After her speech, Rebecca mingled with the crowd, listening to their stories and posing for photos. A young girl approached her shyly. "Ms. Santos, I want to be a lawyer like you when I grow up." Rebecca knelt down to the child's level. "What's your name?" "Maria." "Well, Maria, if that's what you want, I believe you can do it. Study hard and never let anyone tell you what you can't achieve." As the celebration continued, Rebecca noticed someone unexpected enter the room. Judge Harold Blackwood. He stood awkwardly by the door, looking out of place in his suit. Rebecca walked over to greet him. "Your Honor, this is a surprise." "Miss Santos," he nodded formally. "I hope you don't mind my coming. I wanted to see this place for myself." "Not at all. Would you like a tour?" As they walked through the center, Rebecca showed him the computer lab where people learn new skills, the quiet study rooms, and the children's area filled with books. "I had no idea it was so extensive," Judge Blackwood admitted. "When we just see things on paper in court, we miss the human element." They stopped by a wall covered with photos of success stories, center users who had graduated college, started businesses, or achieved other important goals. Rebecca's teenage photo hung among them. "I've been thinking a lot about our case," Judge Blackwood said quietly. "About how I treated you in my courtroom." "That's in the past, Your Honor. Please call me Harold when we're not in court." He hesitated, then continued. "I've served on the bench for 30 years. I like to think I've always been fair, but your case made me realize I've been carrying biases I didn't recognize." Rebecca listened silently as he continued. "I've started a judicial review program. Judges watching other judges for signs of bias or unfair treatment in the courtroom. Several of my colleagues have joined already." "That's wonderful," Rebecca said sincerely. "It will make a real difference." "Your case already has." He smiled slightly. "You know, the press still talks about you, the secret lawyer pop star. Have you taken any new cases?" "Two, actually, both pro bono. And I'm establishing a legal foundation to help community organizations like this one." She paused. "I'm using both my names now. No more hiding who I am." As they returned to the main hall, Mr. Jackson approached with a small plaque. "Judge Blackwood, we're honored by your visit. Would you do us the privilege of hanging this on our wall? It's to commemorate our legal victory." The judge took the plaque, reading the inscription. "Justice prevails when good people stand together." Below was a photo of Rebecca and Mr. Jackson outside the courthouse after the verdict. "I would be honored," Judge Blackwood said. As he hung the plaque on the wall, Rebecca watched the man who had once mocked her now celebrating their victory. The world was changing, one small step at a time. Later, as the celebration wound down, Rebecca sat at an old piano in the corner of the room. Her fingers moved automatically across the keys, playing a gentle melody. A few children gathered around to listen. "Will you sing for us, Ms. Santos?" one asked. Rebecca smiled. "Of course." As she began to sing, her clear voice filling the room, she felt completely at peace. No longer divided between Rebecca Wilson and Ariana Grande, she was simply herself, a musician, a lawyer, a woman determined to make a difference in the world. One case, one song at a time.